Let's start. It's 3 minutes past, so we'll start a bit of introduction. So you moved from Cardiff to Bath, and your present position at Bath is Professor of what, Lorraine?
Environmental psychology, which is what it was at Cardiff as well. So the day job hasn't changed. I'm also still the director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. That job has followed me as well. So not much has changed. I live in Bristol, so part of the rationale for the move was just a slightly shorter commute, but also lots of people at Bath doing interesting things as well to collaborate.
Yes. So what is environmental psychology? Sorry to be.
No, it's not a well-known profession, I don't think. Basically, it's the study of the interaction between individuals and the environment, and it's as simple as that, really. And so the environment captures both the physical environment and to some extent the social environment as well. So it's the built environment, it's the natural environment, and it's the two-way relationship between individuals and that environment. So how the environment impacts on us, so everything from building design and how that might affect how effective we are at work or our well-being, through to kind of how natural environments generally sort of improve our well-being, and also the other way, so how we impact on our environment. And that's the particular direction I specialised in, which is how we impact on climate change in particular. So how, our behaviours and how they cause climate change or emit carbon, and how we can shape those behaviours in more low carbon ways.
And so, I mean, that sounds like a bit more than psychology, or is that?
Yeah, it's quite an interdisciplinary field, actually. So although it is sort of, it's a sub-discipline of psychology, and so a lot of our theories do come from kind of psychology, and our methods too. We work a lot with sort of architects, planners, engineers, all sorts of natural scientists and others, which is why we're often kind of brought into projects that are about CCS, for example, funded by EPSRC, the Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council, and working alongside geologists, engineers and others. So yeah, it's quite normal for us actually to be working in an interdisciplinary environment.
So when did you first come across CCS?
Yeah, it was probably a few years ago. I think a lot of the work that I've been doing has been looking at how the public engages with mitigation options, and that includes behavioural change options, so driving less, for example, or maybe eating less meat or consuming less, but also sort of larger scale technologies, and so everything from electric vehicles and sort of smart homes and smart grids through to carbon capture and storage, and energy technologies and options more generally. So we've actually had a few projects where we've looked at how the public understand different sorts of energy, so renewables, fossil fuels, different sorts of technologies around energy supply, and what shapes those perceptions and how they've evolved over time, and so on. So it's kind of fitted into that sort of broader programme of work. We've had a couple of specific projects looking at perceptions of CCS as part of larger projects. This particular one was an EPSRC funded one.
And I should have asked, what was your original degree? Was it psychology?
So my very first undergraduate degree was actually religious studies and French. So yes, and then I thought about what I could do that would be a useful career, and did a master's in science, culture, and communication, actually at Bath,
Right.
which was in the psychology department, but it was kind of looking at kind of issues around how people engage with science and technology and sort of understand that as part of the world and so on. So it's quite interdisciplinary. And then after a couple of years of working in some other random places, came back and did a PhD there, basically in environmental psychology, looking at how people understand climate change and what shapes that. So it was kind of a slightly odd route, but ending up in psychology.
No, so when was your PhD?
It was well, I think I finished 2005.
So that was the year of the Exeter conference and things like that. So that was quite early on in climate change. I mean, it was there, but it
yeah. I mean, there weren't any. So what I specifically looked at in my PhD was how being flooded might affect people's perceptions of climate change. And I think I was probably the first person, or certainly one of the first few people, to kind of look at the role of experience and in shaping people's perceptions. Incidentally, I found that flood victims were no more concerned about climate change than anyone else. But yeah, so it was reasonably early on in that kind of that research.
Yeah, that was basically when the UKCCSRC started, 2005.
Okay, yeah.
Its first incarnation. Good. Okay. Well, I think we've sort of gone through the introduction. So, Lorraine, if you want to tell us about framing effects on public support for CCS. Everybody else, I think you've muted anyway, but please mute. But can you please put up questions as we're going along? If they're really urgent for explanation, we may ask them. But basically, we'll carry on, Lorraine. Let you go through your presentation, and then, as everybody knows, we'll have time for a relaxed discussion afterwards, and we'll take questions that people have put up and that people want to put in. So please, Lorraine, tell us about framing effects.
Okay, thanks a lot, John, and thanks very much for the invitation to come and talk to you.
No, thank you for coming.
And yes, I just need to acknowledge that what I'm going to be talking about has come out of the Contain project, which was an EPSRC funded project that was led by BGS. They were the main, the PI, but myself and Chris Jones and Dimitrios Xenias were basically did this kind of more public perceptions bit of the work. And you've got a reference there if you want to follow up with the published paper that relates to what I'm presenting. So let me see, hopefully that's moved on. So yeah, just in terms of background, why are we interested? Why would it be useful to think about public perceptions of carbon capture and storage? Well, I think there's kind of a growing recognition that it is important to do, and that not that it's just an add-on or it's a nice to kind of know, but actually that we do need to be thinking about how the public as a whole, and also specific communities that might be affected by CCS projects, how they think about it, and engaging those groups with decision making around CCS for a number of reasons. And broadly speaking, we can identify instrumental, normative and substantive rationales for public engagement. So instrumentally, well, if we think that CCS is an important part of getting to net zero and to tackle climate change, or there might be other sort of important reasons why we want to advocate for CCS, then engaging the public can actually help avoid conflict and polarization. So it can potentially get people on side if at the earliest stage you have a dialogue with people and say, this is why we think CCS is important, and try and hear what their concerns are. It's not a guarantee that you get rid of conflict, but actually early engagement can help to reduce it. And where we've seen opposition to CCS, and obviously most notably in the Netherlands, that some of that is to do with where there could have been better community engagement. And we've seen this, obviously, CCS, as I mentioned, is not the only thing that I look at in terms of public engagement. We've done projects on shale gas and other things too. And so that the same holds really for these other sort of technologies and big sort of energy type issues as well, is engaging the public early on helps to get them on side potentially if you're trying to advocate for it. But on the other hand, there are also people that say, well, we ought to listen to the public, because if we're spending money, public funding on CCS, then, you know, in climate change mitigation strategies, then it's only fair it's only right that we listen to the public. And there might be specific impacts on local communities from CCS projects and other similar developments that mean that we need to be engaging with those communities and giving them a say. And there's a literature that says that the more that you actually engage a wider group of people in decision making about projects, the better those decisions can be. So it can actually potentially improve the quality of decision making as well, the more that we listen to other people and the more that we engage them. So there's a number of reasons why we do this type of work. Okay. So obviously there's a lot of previous research on public engagement with energy and CCS. Generally, this is my son, generally it shows very clearly that when you ask people about kind of different energy sources and ways to mitigate climate change, renewable energy is the one that generally people like most of all. And CCS and things like nuclear biofuels, the public are a bit more ambivalent about. And there's research showing why that is. Those are the values underpinning energy preferences. And so efficiency, nature protection, reliability, etc., are all the sorts of reasons why people gravitate towards renewables over fossil fuels, but also other things. On CCS specifically, well, generally the public doesn't know a lot about it. I think David Reiner presented some very recent survey findings in this seminar series a few weeks ago, showing that 50% of the UK public say they've never heard of CCS. And of those who have heard, most of them have just heard the name but don't really know anything about it. So awareness of CCS continues to be very low, and that's been the case for many years now. And it's interesting that it does seem to have gone up recently, the lack of awareness, which might suggest that it's to do with what's discussed in the media at the moment, the fact that probably CCS is even less discussed than it used to be. Of those people that have heard of it and know something about it, attitudes are pretty ambivalent. So we know that there's a sort of concern that it might, that CCS is kind of seen as, well, maybe it's a temporary fix, that it's kind of, it's not really addressing the root cause of the problem of climate change. There are concerns, specific safety concerns about leaks, etc. The association with kind of coal mining is a concern for some, costs, the ability to mitigate risks and so on are all the sorts of concerns that the public cite. But there is they are positive that it could be a potential part of a strategy to mitigate climate change. So kind of mixed views. And where people do support it, it is contingent on it being part of a wider strategy to cut CO2 emissions and maybe sort of a part of a bridging policy. Interestingly, there's actually very few cross-national studies on attitudes to CCS, which is why we wanted to make what I'll just present, a cross-national study, though the previous few cross-national studies do suggest there are big differences across different countries. The sorts of things that we know shape people's perceptions of CCS, there are various, including knowledge, how much you know about it, the characteristics of the project in question, so whether it's a bioenergy and CCS project or whatever characteristics, whether it's onshore, offshore, all of those sorts of things make a difference. How it's been covered in the media or whether it's been covered as well shapes people's perceptions. The extent to which people believe there's benefits, so maybe there's jobs arising in their local area versus maybe risks, the alternatives available as well shape how people think about it. And at the community level, if a particular area has had experience of energy or extractive industries, that will also colour their views about a particular CCS proposal in that area. So they might have more positive views. At the individual level, people's values, whether they're particularly environmentally concerned, for example, the extent to which they connect with a particular place and see it in a particular way is relevant. And also how people see regulators, developers and others who might be involved in mitigating the risks of CCS is also relevant. And importantly, also we know that there's generally differences between how people see CCS in general and sort of at the national level, for example, if you look at kind of attitudes to CCS versus if you're surveying a particular community and asking them about a particular CCS project, then you might get sort of different factors being more or less relevant in each case. So it's important, I think, to look at the kind of local versus national as we do in this study. We also know that information, of course, can change people's attitudes. You know, generally people don't know very much about it. And so as soon as you give people information about CCS, it can make a difference to what they think about it. And in some pretty early studies, Curry and colleagues, when they gave people information about not just CCS, but a range of different options to mitigate climate change, they found that attitudes to CCS generally became a bit more positive. And I guess they were learning there about the efficacy, but also the costs of various different options. So you can see support for renewables comes down a bit, but CCS support doesn't grow to the size of support for other things like R&D and renewables. So it improves, but it's still not as favourable as other options. But the way in which people interpret information, of course, also depends on how that information is framed, how it's communicated. So what elements of the message are emphasised, what sort of language is used, what imagery is evoked. So this is the idea of framing, so how we communicate effectively. And the kind of frames we use can help to kind of reduce complexity and help with information processing. So there's been some previous research on framing effects with regards to CCS. So if it's framed as helping to address electricity shortfalls, so as an energy security strategy, this early Dutch study found that led to more support for CCS that compared to when CCS was framed as a climate change mitigation strategy. More recently, one UK study found that if you frame CCS as a way in which to deal with waste, then that was more persuasive than either framing it in terms of a climate change or an economic strategy. So, you know, providing jobs or mitigating climate change. And I think that was particularly interesting for us because we've previously done work talking about kind of framing climate change in terms of not being wasteful, so being energy efficient as a rationale for for mitigating climate change. So we wondered if this kind of waste narrative would be quite powerful here when we're talking about CCS. And so we were interested in exploring if we talked about carbon dioxide utilization specifically. So this is obviously where you kind of use the sort of trapped carbon dioxide to make cement and plastic and materials that can be used in other ways. So you're kind of recycling the wasted CO2. So that might be something that we thought could appeal to people and make the idea of CCS more attractive. So we were interested in exploring that a bit more. But one of the really key things that comes out of all the research on CCS and all the kind of theory behind it is that certain frames are more likely to resonate with some groups and might turn off other groups entirely. So they might work with some and not others. And so we were interested in how different audiences might be persuaded by different CCS frames because it might resonate with their kind of core values more. And that links to the fact that we know that people like to they gravitate towards confirmatory evidence and they kind of dismiss anything that sort of might conflict with or challenge their values or their beliefs, which is why you get potentially attitude polarization. That was shown in one CCS framing study where they found that different nationalities responded to CCS information in different ways. Dutch and Scottish participants became more negative after reading a particular bit of information about CCS, whereas the Canadian and Australian participants became more positive reading the same information. So people can respond to information in different ways, potentially polarizing audiences. And again, we wanted to kind of explore how people with different values and different sort of backgrounds and experiences might respond differently to different messages. Okay, so what we did was we did an online survey of the public in 5 countries. So that a sample of just over 5,400 members of the public in the UK, US, Canada, Norway, and the Netherlands. And we chose those countries because they reflect different stages of CCS development. They have some of the projects we looked at were onshore, some were offshore, some were more nascent or cancelled, some were fully developed. And we assume, based on previous research, that those different characteristics would be relevant. We collected the data nearly 3 years ago now, autumn 2017, and you can see there the countries that we chose and the specific CCS projects that we focused on in those different countries, and the sort of the characteristics of those projects. Apologies, it's a bit of a busy slide. So as well as looking at these 5 different countries, we also wanted to compare a national sample in each country with a local sample. So we had basically nationally representative sample, and then we had a sort of booster sample of about 100 or so people who were living near the proposed or current CCS site that we were interested in. So we aimed for about 100, but it was sort of slightly more or less. You can see that's the kind of table sort of towards the bottom there. On the far right hand column, there is the number of participants that we had in the local sample, and then the national sample is the kind of the middle column there, of which there was approximately 1,000 people. And what we did was, well, it was an online survey. We asked a whole load of questions, but after asking some initial questions, we then gave people some information about CCS, but we framed it in different ways. So we framed it in, we gave people a message about CCS, which was framed in one of 3 different ways. So the first way in which we talked about it was that it would be kind of instead of lifestyle change. And so, yeah, so I'll show you that in a second. Then the second one was we paired it with a CDU, a carbon dioxide and utilization message. And then the third one was a with lifestyle change message. So everybody read the first bit of text that you see there describing what CCS is. And we were working with our partners in BGS and elsewhere to kind of check that we got that right. And then the last bit of the message then was one of these 3 different versions that you see at the bottom. So the CCS, business as usual condition, as we called it, was made the claim that actually CCS would help trap CO2 that would otherwise go into the atmosphere, and so that would mean that we wouldn't need to change our way of life to mitigate climate change. So we wouldn't need to fly less, for example, or we wouldn't need to use less energy at home. I'll come back to this at the end, that actually it's not very likely that we would be able to mitigate climate change effectively without changing our behaviour. But for the purposes of this study, we separated out the lifestyle change from the just CCS option. The next condition then was where we paired CCS with a CDU message. So we said we wouldn't need to, CCS is instead of changing our behaviour, and we can use the CO2 then to reuse it to make useful carbon-based products like medicines, plastics, building materials, and many other things, and it would help reduce waste that our society produces. And then the final message was a CCS plus lifestyle change condition, which is probably more in tune with what the Committee on Climate Change would say we need to reach net zero, which is that we said that CCS can help tackle climate change, but that we also need to make necessary changes to our society and lifestyle, like flying less and using less energy at home, and together that would help slow climate change. So these are, I won't go into too much detail about how we measured stuff, and you will kind of get a sense of that in the next few slides anyway, but we had a number of kind of variables that measured what we were really interested in, so awareness, attitudes, support for CCS, etc. And then we had a few measures that were kind of measuring things about the participants themselves, like their values, how attached they were to place, their climate change skepticism, environmental identity, technophilia, and various demographics and sort of other contextual variables. So I won't kind of go into too much detail, but ask me if you're interested. So what did we find? Well, the first thing we asked about was, well, how much would you say you know about carbon capture and sequestration, also known as carbon capture and storage, or CCS? So we captured every possible way, hopefully, of naming it. And consistent with previous studies, we found that a lot of people just hadn't heard of it at all across the 5 countries. So that's the darker the colour, the lowest level of awareness. But you can see there's some very big differences between the countries. And so where there is the highest level of awareness seems to be Norway. And obviously they've got, the Sleipner project was where we were focused particularly. They've got a fairly established industry there. So awareness was higher in Norway. It seemed to be lowest in the US, interestingly, with Canada, the UK and the Netherlands being sort of somewhere in between. Then we asked about people's attitudes, and there were a number of questions here, but you can hopefully kind of see what I've done here in the figure is to group together the total agreement. So whether you strongly agree or quite agree is grouped together in the darker colour. If you slightly disagree or strongly disagree, I've grouped those together in the lighter colour. So you can see that when we asked whether CCS should be implemented in your country, more people agreed than disagreed. Similarly, for feeling that benefits of CCS outweighed the risks, there's a slightly higher proportion agreeing than disagreeing. But then the rest of the items here are kind of show there's a little bit more ambivalence, because really they agreed with everything, whether it was a good or a bad statement. So CO2 stored underground might leak back into the atmosphere, some very strong agreement with that, but equally strong agreement that CCS helps to keep an important greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere, but that it encourages the prolonged use of fossil fuels, it's risky, yet it might have a positive impact on the economy, but science is underestimating the risks, and money that the government will spend on CCS should be spent elsewhere, somewhat more mixed views. So really kind of people generally feeling there are both good and bad things about CCS, which is broadly in line with the previous literature. When we break down the support for CCS in terms of our, like the national sample versus the smaller local sample, we see also a very clear difference here. And that basically in almost all cases, the local support for CCS being implemented is higher than the national support. So local support is higher. And that's really pronounced in the UK, which is interesting. And again, if we think about, I did show earlier kind of what these places were, that's the Peterhead project that we were interested in. So it's around that area in Scotland. But yeah, so there's no suggestion of NIMBYism in this case, but actually the opposite of that, YIMBYism. Okay, so this next slide, don't worry about that big regression table, I will summarize it, but basically this is looking at what predicts support for CCS. This is before we gave them any information. We just gave them the definition of what CCS is, and to see what predicts people's level of support. And we found that nationality was the strongest predictor, so which country you come from. So the UK showing the strongest level of support, closely followed by Norway, whereas the Netherlands much higher opposition. But other predictors that significantly predicted support included proximity. So again, the local people more supportive than the national sample. Being attached to your local place was a positive predictor. Being younger, being male, having a more right-wing, right-of-centre political ideology, believing in climate change, being technophilia, having technophilia or being technophilic, having stronger environmental identity, but curiously lower environmental values. There might be some interaction effects going on there. And working in the energy industry was also a positive predictor. So some of those things probably not that surprising, but some of them perhaps slightly novel. I don't know that people had asked about technophilia, for example, before. Yeah, and also we also asked about sort of different forms of CCS or different uses. And so here we asked the question, how supportive or unsupportive are you of the following ways of generating power or reducing carbon emissions? So we wanted to kind of capture quite a few things in there, because we've got reducing the amount of energy we use, for example, as well as energy supply options. And you can see that support is higher for renewables. That's unsurprising. And people actually also like the idea of reducing the amount of energy we use, so demand management. They don't like fossil fuels, and we know that already, or fracking. But if we go down, we can see that depending on what type of CCS we're talking about, there's pretty different levels of support as well. So broadly speaking, people are quite positive about CCS per se, but there are differences. So they don't particularly like it if it's paired with shale gas or fracking. And there's lower support as well for underground coal gasification with CCS and coal with CCS, whereas bioenergy with CCS, and to a lesser extent heavy industry with CCS and gas with CCS actually are more supported. So the bioenergy clearly showing most support of the CCS options. One of the things we were interested in as well was, if you tell people how much it might cost them personally to implement CCS, then it might make a difference. He's back. Go and find him. He's downstairs. Sorry. Yeah, would it make a difference if you told people how much it would cost them? So we asked them, implementing CCS comes at a cost, currently estimated at between £6 and £12 on the average electricity bill per year. But if we don't implement CCS in this country now, energy bills could rise even more in the future because CO2 mitigation measures will be necessary. How willing would you be to accept the immediate implementation of CCS if this increase in bills was avoided, this future increase in bills, basically? And so hopefully you can see that it is small, but it is significant that before we mentioned this cost information, people were sort of moderately supportive of CCS. Once we'd mentioned the cost information, though, that support significantly went down. So there was less willingness to support CCS once they realised there would be a small cost associated with it. Then coming to the kind of main framing bit, the experimental manipulation, when we gave people one of those three messages that I showed you earlier, so CCS business as usual is the one on the left. So this is CCS where we're saying it can help mitigate climate change and we won't need to change our lifestyle. The one in the middle is CCS plus CDU, carbon dioxide and utilization, that it helps make other stuff out of the waste product. And one on the right is CCS plus lifestyle change is required to tackle climate change. And again, the levels of support differ to a small degree across the different conditions, but they are significant differences. And so the CDU one was the most popular. So it significantly increased support for CCS when we talked about pairing it with carbon dioxide utilization to make other products. And again, apologies for the horrible table on the left. But basically, what this is showing is that when we look at the change in CCS support after giving people that information compared to before we'd given it to them, we see that actually different messages appeal to different people. So we found that Norwegians expressed significantly higher support for CCS in a business as usual scenario, so the one where lifestyles don't have to change. we found that people with stronger environmental values expressed significantly lower support for that message. So they actually preferred the lifestyle change message happening as well, rather than a sort of techno-fix type scenario. Climate skeptics and those with no or few children expressed more support for CCS when it was CDU framed, interestingly. And I'll come back to that. And then there were some demographic things. So men, older people, and those with higher incomes showed lower support for CCS after reading the CCS and lifestyle change message. And again, I can sort of maybe say something about why I think that is in just a second. Okay, so I guess just trying to sum up all of this. The first thing is, it was really worth doing this cross-national study because we did find it was actually one of the strongest predictor of CCS support was which country people lived in. And so the Norwegians were most aware of CCS, but the UK was the most positive. The lowest level of support was in the Netherlands, which is probably due to its kind of history and the Barendrecht issue in particular. Proximity to a CCS facility was also important, and we found that people living close by were actually more supportive of CCS than the general samples, perhaps due to their kind of historical dependence on it, the energy industry for jobs, their greater familiarity with it, and so on. And that's partly consistent with previous research. So studies have previously found that around carbon capture facilities, there's generally more support for CCS, this kind of YIMBYism, yes, in my backyard, whereas there tends to be more opposition, or NIMBYism, is more likely around storage sites, CCS storage sites. So there is it matters whether you're talking about the capture or the storage as to whether you see YIMBYism or NIMBYism. And so it might be that what we actually ended up doing inadvertently was to oversample capture sites rather than the kind of processing or pipeline or storage sites. So that's something that I think we can kind of maybe try and follow up, is sort of looking at that, you know, those proximity effects in more detail. But I think it definitely kind of, hopefully it sort of challenges at least any assumption that NIMBYism is inevitable, that if you live near an energy type development or a big development, you will oppose it. And it really, there's so much evidence now that suggests it just depends completely on, you know, the history of the area, how attached you are to the area, etc., and whether you anticipate economic benefits, etc., from the potential development. So geography is important, but how you present information is also quite important. So we found that if you pair CCS with bioenergy, so BECCS, then that leads to more support for CCS, which is good, because I guess there's a lot of emphasis on BECCS as part of climate mitigation scenarios. Fossil fuel and industry pairings of CCS were generally less supportive, or certainly the fossil fuel ones. So that's worth bearing in mind, that it depends what type of CCS you're talking about or what it's paired with. Secondly, cost really matters, of course, and that's not very surprising. But what is maybe surprising is the fact that we did tell people that it would be not very expensive to implement CCS, £6 to £12 per year, and that if we that compared to paying that, actually it would be much more expensive if we didn't do that. And yet, merely mentioning that there would be a price tag attached to CCS meant that it lowered support. So I think we just need to be careful about kind of how we present information, and that we, just by saying, hey, it's really cheap, it's only a few pounds, people might think, oh, there's a cost at all. I'd assumed it was completely free. Or, you know, they just hadn't thought about the cost side. So that was quite interesting as well. And then other things, the other sort of frames that we looked at were significant as well. So what we found was that the CDU framed information, carbon dioxide utilization information, led to greater support for CCS than either a CCS on its own or CCS plus lifestyle change frame. And I think, so it did seem like maybe describing how CO2 as a kind of waste product could be recycled to make new products seemed to be quite appealing to the public to help show the benefits of CCS. It also mattered where people lived as to which frame was most persuasive. So Norwegians liked the business as usual, the CCS on its own frame. But individual factors were even more important. So as I've shown, people with strong environmental values don't like CCS on its own. They like to see it as part of a broader strategy to tackle climate change that includes changing lifestyles and society more generally. So depending on who you're talking to, you know, if you're trying to persuade them about the value of CCS, then we need to kind of adjust that message, because actually some people see it as only valuable if we're doing other things as well. And interestingly, in our project, we'd kind of, I suppose, assumed that you had to believe in climate change in order to support CCS, because it's largely sort of championed as a part of kind of what we need to do to mitigate climate change. But actually, we found that we could increase support for CCS amongst climate skeptics when we paired it with this CDU information, perhaps because the waste framing maybe serves to reduce the identity threat associated with climate change beliefs, which we've studied quite a bit before. Or it might just be that it's kind of showing that CCS is useful beyond just mitigating climate change, that actually there's something potentially quite valuable there in terms of turning a waste product into other things. So people don't need to necessarily believe in climate change to see some value there. And then finally, this intriguing finding that people in high income groups, for example, as well as older men, showed decreased support for CCS when it was paired with a lifestyle change framing. Well, we know from our previous studies that people in higher income groups are more likely to be skeptical of climate change because they find it quite threatening, the idea that they might have to change their lifestyle. And we know that income is a strong predictor of people's carbon footprint. The more you earn, the higher your carbon footprint in general. So what we might be seeing here is some kind of, potentially sort of some identity threat, that if you're talking about CCS as being that you still need lifestyle change to mitigate climate change, that might be threatening for people that have to change their lifestyle a lot. So that's an interesting psychological response, I think, there. So just summing up then, I think it's really interesting just how varied attitudes to climate change are across countries, regions, individuals, etc., and also how different frames can shape CCS support, and we've looked at a number of those. We've really tried to sort of situate CCS see it through different lenses, either as a sort of techno fix or as a more kind of systemic part of tackling climate change, or as a way of avoiding waste and maybe sort of moving towards a more circular economy. So this was quite interesting, I think, just to compare those different ways of framing it, and they clearly appeal to different groups in different ways. So that's important, I think, if we want to sort of communicate climate CCS more effectively, then we need to understand our audience and kind of maybe sort of tailor the message a little bit towards whichever group we're talking to have more effect. It does challenge the fact that any assumption that living near to a CCS site will mean opposition. On the contrary, it seems actually you're more likely to see support, but it does depend on the specific area that you're looking at. And I think just the final sort of point here really is that people's attitudes to CCS are still quite malleable because people don't know very much about it. And so it's only once they've established an attitude that it becomes difficult to change. So we're at this point now where still not many people know about it. So there's the potential to kind of either to shape it in a positive or negative way. And actually, if we link to people's sort of core values and that who they are, that understand their background, then we're more likely to effectively shape that. So targeting messages is important. I think what's also important though is that this kind of links to this really immediate limitation in the study actually, was that one of our frames posed CCS as being an alternative to lifestyle change. But obviously in reality, we know that lifestyle change is going to be required and probably will need CCS2 to reach net zero. And so it was kind of a bit arbitrary that we separated these, but it was useful still to see the difference it makes, that if you just separate out the lifestyle change, do people become more supportive? So it was a limitation, but I think it does show that actually, but that is still how, obviously that does give some sense of how people do sort of absorb information on a day-to-day basis in kind of sound bites, in kind of very small sort of pieces of information. That's how they kind of absorb news. But more informative, I think, is to engage people in kind of a bit deeper discussion and deliberate over the relative costs of different options. You know, we told people it would only cost a little bit to use CCS, but other costs would be more. But if you'd actually kind of maybe spelled out, well, we were actually talking about this much more with the alternatives, or there could be different risks and benefits associated with CCS and also these other options, having that kind of much broader discussion about kind of how CCS fits in with other alternatives to mitigate climate change, I think we would have, you know, potentially seen some slightly different outcomes and richer debates. So there are caveats, you know, and limitations with this type of research, but I still think, you know, it's quite interesting that we've managed to show some quite interesting effects from how we've communicated it. So yeah, so I'll leave it there, and really keen to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorraine. So people can put in questions via the chat, and we'll get you on. But I've got a question, just an explanation, technical terms that I didn't understand. Environmental identity and environmental values. What did you mean by environmental identity?
Yes, that's if you see yourself as an environmental person. So the sorts of items that we ask there are things like, I see myself as a green person, or I see myself as being committed to environmental issues. So it's very closely linked to environmental values, because if you have a strong environmental value, you will see yourself as a green person, but it's just a very slightly different kind of way of measuring it, basically.
Okay, thank you. And then I've got, I guess, I sort of understand this business about what you say about particularly a project. And that's, you know, you can say things about projects in different ways, but the project is the project, and its characteristics are what they are. So what can you say about the characteristics of a CCS project that will affect what happens? So for example, if you use materials that are more or less toxic in the process, or if you had something that was more or less visually intrusive, things like that. I mean, those features.
Yeah, and I'd need to go back to the literature to check all of the kind of various things that have made a difference in studies in the past, but it would be everything from, yeah, how it looks, to the kind of various sort of any, you know, risks associated with particular, you know, the processes at that site, to, you know, are there going to be jobs available, you know, what sort of pipeline is it going to, you know, involve, or, you know, sort of how it's transported, and is it onshore or offshore, and also, I guess, the quality of the engagement process with the local community as well. So that's been shown to really be quite important in shaping people's perceptions, as well as the specific sort of technical things of the project itself. So there's a lot of things I think that could be relevant.
I guess what I'm sort of working towards there is have you seen any evidence of people actually trying to engage with various groups of stakeholders, and the locals are one, but perhaps policymakers or others, and then actually shaping the project in the light of that feedback? Because by the time you've got something designed and you try to communicate it, yes, you can try and put a spin on it one way or another, but you've got what you've got, you know. And it as people at Barendrecht found, look, it's, you know, it's on storage, we don't like it.
I mean, that's a really good point.
People doing that, because it seems like it would be quite a good idea, really.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, I suppose there will be limitations to what could be addressed in light of public concerns, but so I would need to kind of check what specific engagement examples. I think I might be wrong, but did the Big Sky project in the US or something? I think they might have been quite a good example of where they did some very good engagement. But I'd need to.
It's beforehand. I wonder if Peterhead did some, because they put the absorber for that unit, which was quite big, in the middle of the plant, so it wouldn't look as sort of prominent. And they also took some trouble to make the pipeline adjacent to the plant to go offshore directly from the plant rather than going onshore. But I don't think I've seen any evidence that they did that after having done public consultation, but I just don't know.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I'm not sure actually. There may well be others on the call that actually do know good examples of where projects did respond concretely to local concerns.
Yes. Okay. No, it is interesting because as well as having some idea about telling people about the technology is also in a stage where it can develop in different ways.
Yeah.
A lot of projects have different ideas about how to do things, and without any input, you may well go to the public later and find out you've not done it in the best way.
I mean, I think, to be honest, most of the research about kind of community engagement with CCS suggests that it's done too late on, basically, to be able to really inform anything. And so, yeah, it's kind of a bit of an add-on and not very substantive. So although there would obviously be major constraints in what they could change, I think they often don't do it at the earliest stage that they could to enable any sort of changes to be made.
Yeah, okay. I suppose the sort of possibly the permitting process includes notionally a public engagement stage, which is quite early on, but whether that's early enough.
I think there was a quote on my first slide, which was, I can't remember, is it from the DEC CCS roadmap or something from a few years ago, where it said something like community engagement needs to go way beyond the regulatory requirements or something. So yeah, there is some kind of, you have to engage to some extent, but it's, doesn't require very profound engagement or deep engagement. But they're sort of saying it really needs to be sort of more substantive than that.
Yes, that's very interesting. So we've got a question from Claire Bond. Do you want to ask the question, Claire?
Hi Lorraine, great talk, really enjoyed it. I was just interested around the framing aspects of your kind of shale gas fracking scenario, and whether you actually use the term fracking, which obviously is quite a pejorative term, I would say anyway. So just really interested in that.
Yeah, Claire, could you just tell us briefly where you're from?
Oh, sorry, yeah, I'm at the University of Aberdeen, and I'm structural geologist, but have interests in kind of framing and social aspects of energy transition technologies.
So in this particular survey, well, we did just when we had the list of which of the ways of generating power reducing carbon emissions would you support, we said shale gas or fracking. So which is not particularly technically accurate, I guess, but so yeah, we use the term fracking. In other studies, various people have found that if you talk about, and this is particularly in the US, if you use the term fracking, it results in people being more negative than if you talk about hydraulic fracturing. But we've just done, as part of another project, a NERC-funded project about shale gas, a survey where we compared fracking and hydraulic fracturing, and we found no significant difference in attitudes or support, actually. So, and that was a UK one. So it's interesting. It certainly in the US, it seems to have made a difference, that language, but maybe less so in the UK. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just that people just see them as synonymous. Or it's interesting actually. But you're right. There's it kind of sounds like it's pejorative, but it doesn't seem to make a huge difference. People just don't like it.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to thanks. Just interested around the use of terminology around stimulation or fracking anyway. So and just what that means to different people. So yeah, thank you.
Should I, there's another one in the chat, should I take
Yeah,
that?
I think we've got, is it Ranjan?
Yes, hi there. Hi.
Yeah, do you want to ask your question, Ranjan?
Yeah, so, hi, I'm Ranjan from Element Energy in Cambridge. I just had a question about the comparison between local and the national. How easy is it to ensure that the national samples that you've looked at in terms of attitude are kind of representative of the whole country? What's the kind of care that needs to be taken in kind of assembling that?
Yeah, I think I got most of that. Yeah, so it is. So with online surveys, it's not always easy to get like a completely representative sample of a country. That's definitely the case. What we did was we got a quota sample in terms of ensuring representativeness of I think it was age, gender, and maybe region as well of the countries. So we were broadly representative, but then in terms of kind of probably some of the other demographics and attitudes, they might be underrepresented. So the very wealthiest, for example, the very poorest groups tend not to be so well represented in these sorts of surveys. And, you know, obviously it assumes that you have a computer and that you're, you know, supportive of research. So there will be groups that are generally underrepresented in this sort of research. So it is a caveat that it's not a totally representative sample, but it's kind of as close as we could get with the methodology, basically.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It was quite encouraging to see that NIMBYism was less popular than you maybe would anticipate. But one thing I was wondering is whether there's a tendency for people who are interested in environmental issues to fill in a survey like this in the first place, for example, and that might, you know, bias it in some way towards people with pro-environmental attitudes.
No, I don't think so. So because we went through an online panel, so basically just a research company that just gets people to fill in surveys, you get people from like whose attitudes are, you know, they just get paid to do surveys basically. So in as far as it's biased, it's towards people who would want to earn some money that way. But not that they have a particular kind of opinion one way or the other, because we always start off by just saying, oh, this is just an attitude. We don't tell them there's anything to do with the environment up front. So we try to avoid at least that bias creeping in, that we just say it's about kind of current issues or something, and then, you know, it sort of becomes clear it's about CCS or something. So we try and sort of avoid that happening if possible. And I mean, we because we asked various like value questions and political ideology questions, they came out as pretty representative actually. So yeah.
So Lorraine, a question on carbon capture and storage means, well, it covers a wide range of different technologies. We've just seen an announcement of £100 million support for direct air capture. Do you think what you said would include direct air capture? And anyway, how do you think direct air capture would be viewed?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I think I have colleagues that are looking at that actually, and I don't know what their latest findings are. But my guess is that it would be seen as in a very similar way, in that it's sort of maybe it's a techno fix. It's not really kind of addressing the core causes of climate change, and so there would be sort of very contingent support, that there needs to be a lot of other things going on, and that, you know, any risks need to be mitigated. So my hunch would be it would be seen as very similar, and not hugely favourable, but kind of some ambivalence around it. But I think there are other people that are actually doing work on this, so they may be on this call, so I don't want to guess too far.
Yeah, well, if they want to make any comments, I guess that just raises a question: lifestyle change and changes. It sounds like people weren't willing to change to pay a bit more for their energy, or to pay for cleaning up the mess they're producing? I mean, do people see that as a change, or paying money as a change, or not?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, again, it sort of links back to the limitation of this methodology, which is that you kind of, you're really just sort of scratching the surface of people's response to the idea of CCS, and you know, it's something that they almost certainly wouldn't have really come across before. They know very little, so they're responding to the very little bits of information that you give them. There's a technology that might help mitigate climate change, and then you mention there's a cost, and well, okay, not quite as positive. Whereas, and so I'm also involved in the UK Citizens Assembly on climate change, where it's a completely different method. You get 110 members of the public, really demographically and attitudinally representative, to discuss over many weekends all the ins and outs of the various options for mitigating climate change, of which CCS is one that was talked about. And then you can sort of say, wow, relative to these other things, this isn't actually that bad. This is, you know, and so you get a much more kind of nuanced and sort of balanced set of views out of the end of that. And broadly speaking, people really are supportive of lifestyle change and of paying to tackle climate change. And so I don't know if you saw a week or so ago, there was some initial results from that, the Citizens Assembly on climate change, and people are really positive about the idea of lifestyle change to tackle climate change. So when you really get into the detail of, we need to tackle climate change and these are some options, people are really very supportive of lifestyle change, including paying a bit. But in this kind of, this research, when you sort of spring the cost on them sort of out of nowhere, it's then it a little bit reduces support, but yeah, small but significant reduction.
Yes. So Claire's got a question, another question. Claire, do you want to ask that?
Okay. Oh, I don't know if she wants to read it out, or I could just, I could do it.
Yeah, get started. If Claire's got to follow on.
So the question is, for storage, did we specify onshore versus offshore? Obviously, they're with the different countries, Netherlands versus the US, have different experiences. So I think in the information we gave people, we did not say one way or the other, whether it was onshore or offshore storage. But the reason we chose the different countries was because some of them are onshore, some of them are offshore. I think it was 2 onshore and 3 offshore. So we assumed that in the countries with the onshore, that specific onshore experience might influence their perceptions in a different way to the countries where it's offshore. And so let me just double check. Let me just stop guessing and actually have a look. So in the US, it was the Petronova project, which is onshore. Canada, the Quest project is onshore, but in the UK, Norway and Netherlands, they're all offshore. And did that reflect? And so,
so the Netherlands was offshore?
In this case, it was the road project.
Okay. But that didn't actually happen, did it?
It says it was a demonstration project that was launched in 2015, but I don't know what the current status is.
Yeah, it got cancelled, I think. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so at the time when we did the survey, which was autumn 2017, I think the only one that had actually been cancelled at that point was the Peterhead project in Scotland. All the rest were sort of up and running in some form.
Cool. Thanks. Sorry, I had to nip away for childcare stuff, but I just caught the end of that. I guess I was just interested in kind of like the Groningen kind of, you know, Netherlands clearly have had issues with onshore, and I just wondered how much influence you thought that had. Even if you were talking about offshore, they have these experiences that are maybe kind of more negative around extraction onshore or storage onshore.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's relevant, and that's why I included it. But it didn't go exactly the way we'd assumed, because I suppose I had assumed maybe that anything offshore would be fine about. Anything onshore they would be a bit more concerned about. But it didn't really go in that direction, because the most positive group were the UK group, which was wait, no, that was offshore. The most negative group was the Netherlands, which is an offshore scheme, but they have the history of some onshore. So I think it maybe just depends like a bit more locally on the history of their experiences. And yeah, so.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to your point about it being very, we're still in that kind of malleable phase. And I guess, the more experiences people have, they get more kind of, I'm going to say, set in their ways, set in their mindset. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I can remember back in, I guess it was around 2005, the civil servant then in charge of CCS, a guy called Brian Morris, when asked, somebody said, "Oh, Brian, but why aren't we doing onshore storage? It'd be much cheaper. We've got a few places we could do it." And he said, "You will not do onshore storage. You're going offshore. Nobody lives offshore." He very definitely didn't want to get a precedent started there.
Yeah. I mean, I could sort of see that that's a sensible assumption, but I think there is a bit more nuance probably to it.
Yeah. Well, he wasn't taking any risks.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what do you think you'd like to do if you're going to extend this work? I mean, would you try and get more sort of citizens panels on it and get them spend more time, or would you talk to more people, or what would you do?
Yeah, I think that probably it's probably going a bit more down the deliberative route and actually putting CCS in the context of alternatives a bit more, because that's a bit more informative rather than in the abstract saying, do you like it or not, or if we sort of tweak the wording. I think that is quite interesting, and the CDU bit was quite sort of novel, but I think given where we are in the debate, and as you say, with direct air capture and stuff, particularly now, the focus is probably looking at what the current most likely policies are and relative support that the public has for those things, and what, and under what circumstances. So I think that requires a bit more of a deliberative sort of in-depth discussion. And I think so. The results from the UK Citizens Assembly, the main results will be coming out early September. So we'll get quite a lot of insight, I think, there on how the public support, what they think of CCS in the grand scheme of how we tackle climate change. So from that point, I think then we can kind of think in a bit more detail about, right, so what else do we need to now explore in terms of who supports it, who doesn't, or how we can, where we can go in terms of research.
Yes, well, I think also on that timescale, we'll be seeing which projects are going forward to further studies under the Industry Strategy Challenge Fund. So, which I think would include air capture in the short term anyway. But the various cluster projects will be having, so maybe something to do they'll be doing, or more generally can be done. Be interesting.
Yeah, I think so. And also I think just looking at, I suppose, sort of intervention studies actually around engagement. So I mean, if these projects are going ahead, then let's conduct engagement in an evidence-based way, so that communities are effectively engaged at the earliest stage, and let's evaluate that rigorously so that we actually know what works and why not.
What sort of timescale and budget are you talking about for things like that? And how many people? I mean, what is it? Is this a 2-year program or a 2-week program, or?
Well, I mean, I think for sort of evaluating community and engagement, I think depending on the, how big the project is, you'd sort of want to kind of look at it over the lifetime of the project and beyond, actually, into its kind of, running, when it's actually up and running. So you'd kind of, it would probably be quite a long-term sort of thing, looking at how the developers and how the various kind of groups involved, stakeholders involved, engage with the community and how effective that is, and ultimately how attitudes change over the course of that. And because sometimes what we see is that there might be opposition at the earlier stage, and depending on engagement, that may or may not be mitigated. But once a development is up and running, then sometimes attitudes just become more positive over time. People can see that, well, there's some jobs associated with it, or maybe the risks I was concerned about didn't come to pass, or whatever the case may be. It's interesting to look much longer term over how attitudes evolve.
And I guess just sort of thinking about the projects that are going up, Claire asked another question. What about CCS and hydrogen? Have you looked at that as a separate option?
I don't think we did. No, I don't think that was amongst our list. But yeah, where would I predict that? I mean, I think there'd be sort of low levels of awareness about what hydrogen, what hydrogen is and what could be the risks, etc., and more benefits. So I think pretty ambivalent, actually, I'm guessing. But yeah, that would be an interesting research question.
Yeah, it's probably going on somewhere even as we speak, actually, some of the hydrogen-based clusters. Okay, all right. Well, I think that's most of the issues that people wanted to raise. Thanks for everybody putting in questions, particularly Claire. And thanks very much, Lorraine, for coming and telling us about your work.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Okay, Karis, anything you want to say before we leave?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well. It's been great hearing from you today, and yeah, it was really interesting to hear about your research and kind of what was the answers that were coming out of that. It was really interesting to hear. Just to let everyone know as well what's happening next week. We've got one of our deputy directors, Paul Fennell, speaking to us on Wednesday, and he's going to be doing a CO2 capture 101 for us. And then on Friday we have Jeremy Carey, who's the director of Exegetic and also the chair of the UKCCSRC board, giving us a lecture on what can we learn from other industries about using public funding to make CCS investable. And that will actually conclude our guest lecture series for the spring, although we're well into summer now anyway. But that'll be the last guest lecture series then until the guest lecture series until September. But again, thank you, Lorraine, for today. It was great to hear from you.
Thanks a lot, Karis, and yeah, have a good weekend, everyone.
Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thanks again, Lorraine.